Destiny 2, for the first time in quite a while, is a game on the rise. Sunsetting is dead, the amount of powerful loot added to the game the last 2 seasons has been phenomenal, and the story in-game has been incredible, to the point that it feels like I'm watching a high-end TV show with the ongoing weekly narrative. Stasis has also finally been brought down to reasonable levels inside PvP, and a big overhaul for Trials of Osiris is fast approaching as we barrel towards next season. And perhaps the crown jewel of Season of the Splicer has been the introduction of the Destiny 1 raid Vault of Glass into Destiny 2. Bungie managed to not only retain the magic of the vault in D2, but they were able to do so while also modernizing the raid to account for the power levels of Guardians in the current game. But after the first 24 hours, the raid's shortcomings were exposed for all to see. The primary issue being just how easy the raid is in the combat department. And this is an issue that plagues all raids in Destiny 2, not just Vault of Glass. And the reward structure could use some tuning as well, especially for the older raids, none of which ever award Pinnacle power gear, nor are they farmable for Spoils of Conquest like Vault of Glass is. Raids in Destiny are my favorite part of the game, but I believe that they can become so much more. In this video, I'm going to explain how raids can evolve into the Pinnacle PvE experience. We're going to discuss how raids can be improved on a foundational level with improved loot structures and additional accessibility to get more people into raiding, and we will then discuss how raids can be amped up to become the definitive endgame experience for PvE. And finally, we'll have a discussion about how we can spice up raids on a week-to-week basis, making the power grind less stale and offering some unique loot opportunities and enhanced difficulty options not before seen in raids. Let's jump in. So, first things first, I want to talk about how I'd improve the foundation of raiding, in particular, the loot structure and the accessibility of raiding to less experienced players. The first thing that raids need is for the weapons from these activities to evolve into gear that is worthy of being called endgame caliber. Back in January, I made a standalone video on how I'd improve the weapon rarity system in Destiny. However, that video was made during the era of sunsetting, and some of the ideas in that video are a bit too generous with loot that no longer has an expiration date. With that said, I still think that our current raid weapons should be upgraded into a new tier of weaponry called Pinnacle weapons, and they would have the following attributes. First, they would have 2 choices in the final trait column, giving you better odds to secure the role you're looking for. Secondly, they would have the ability to reroll 1 of the perk nodes or the masterwork of the gun. The cost to reroll a weapon attribute would be 1 Ascendant Shard, 10 Spoils of Conquest, and 25 legendary shards. And finally, they would come with an additional intrinsic perk that is relevant to the activity in which the weapon was acquired, such as kills with this weapon have increased chance to drop heavy ammo inside the Vault of Glass, or this weapon deals increased damage to oracles inside Vault of Glass. Now, I can already hear some of you furiously typing down in the comments, actually, Bungie said that we can't have extra intrinsic perks on weapons. And yes, a few months back, weapons feature lead Chris Proctor spoke in a TWAB and called out 3 specific issues with adding an extra intrinsic perk to our weapons. The first issue was performance related. I'm no software developer, but the fact that even a single additional weapon perk could cause other perks to randomly turn on and off seems really sketchy. Either each perk has to communicate constantly with Bungie servers, and there isn't enough allocated bandwidth, or more likely, there isn't enough RAM on last-gen consoles to support so many different perks activating at a given time. Or perhaps it's just a case of spaghetti code. Regardless, Bungie is a huge studio filled with brilliant devs and engineers. This performance issue can absolutely be solved, but Bungie has seemingly decided it isn't worth the time or the resources. Hopefully this changes at some point in the future, because if it doesn't, weapon design will continue to stagnate until they do. The second issue that Chris mentioned was because power creep. Considering the type of extra intrinsic perk that I want to add would only help you in the activity in which the weapon was acquired and nowhere else in the game, this wouldn't cause game-wide power creep. It would be activity power creep. But we already have things like raid mods that only work in a given raid. So what's the harm with weapons doing the same thing? The third and final issue that Chris brought up is a moot point, because I'd add the extra intrinsic perk to all weapon drops from a raid, be it Pinnacle or Adept versions. And speaking of which, in addition to upgrading base raid weaponry to the Pinnacle status, I would also introduce Adept raid weapons. These Adept raid weapons would have all the attributes of their Pinnacle counterparts, but would also include an additional Adept mod socket, giving these weapons some extra spice befitting of the highest tier of loot in the game. Yes, this would be a bit of power creep, but considering that the current Adept mods in the game are basically just a second Masterwork slot, I think everything would be okay. This isn't a Luna's Howl or Not Forgotten type situation where some players had access to literal game-breaking perks that others did not. An extra 3 bullets in the chamber is not at all comparable to OG Magnificent Howl. With weapons out of the way, let's now talk about difficulty options for raids. The first difficulty option would be the standard normal mode difficulty that raids are today. However, in normal mode, I would include a soft form of the contest modifier, placing you at 10 power below each encounter of the raid. Bungie is already starting to use the contest modifier more frequently in activities outside of GM Nightfalls or Day 1 raids. Look no further than the normal mode version of the Presage mission, where the enemies remain tanky and dangerous regardless of your power level. This is because Bungie is enforcing a version of the contest modifier in that activity. The biggest problem with raids today is that the combat side is just too easy. While a master mode for raids will be coming to the game in July, I still think that the normal mode of raids needs to be slightly more difficult. Raids are supposed to be the Pinnacle PvE experience. The ads should be more threatening in raids than they are in Gambit. The second difficulty option would be a master mode, and I'll dig into the specifics of my vision for master raids in the next part of this video. Now, let's talk about loot. For normal raids, on your first clear per character per week, you should receive either a Pinnacle weapon or a high stat armor piece, 5 Spoils of Conquest, and 2 enhancement prisms for each of the main encounters. Additionally, on your first final boss clear per account per week, you should receive an Ascendant Shard. And finally, for subsequent raid runs in a week on the same character, you should continue to receive 5 Spoils of Conquest from each encounter. The biggest change to the loot structure that I'd make for normal mode raids is that all raids would become as farmable as the current raid. There was a massive backlash at the start of Season of the Splicer when Deepstone Crypt not only lost its status as a Pinnacle power gear source, but it also became unfarmable, as encounters no longer granted Spoils of Conquest on repeat runs on a character. I'm okay with just a single raid in a given week having Pinnacle power rewards, but every raid should be infinitely farmable for Spoils of Conquest. Stop being so stingy, Bungie. Additionally, I would add a final chest vendor to each raid in the game, meaning that Garden of Salvation and Last Wish would become as farmable as Deepstone Crypt and Vault of Glass. In normal mode, the final chest vendor in each raid would mimic the structure introduced in Deepstone Crypt and Vault of Glass, with a row of caches to help acquire missing pieces of gear from that raid, a second row allowing you to acquire armor with a base stat total of 58 or higher in the slot of your choosing, and a third row of the Pinnacle version of weapons from a given raid. Before we move on to master raids, there is one more foundational change to raiding that needs to be addressed: accessibility. Right now, only a quarter of the entire player base has ever completed a raid in Destiny 2. Considering the time and attention that raids receive from Bungie, not to mention the fact that they're just the best content the game has to offer, it is a travesty that more people have not experienced raiding in Destiny. Bungie made a half-hearted attempt to address this with guided games, a feature feature that has been in beta since the game launched in 2017. It's an outdated, archaic, and ultimately failed attempt at getting more people to raid. Instead, what the game really needs is an in-game group finder on the level of other industry-leading MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft. I made a video about this very topic a few months back, in which I detailed how the Helm is actually the perfect place for an in-game group finder, as it is a private instance with a vault, postmaster, and just about anything else you might need before embarking into an end-game activity. I'll put a link down in the description if you'd like to see more details about that proposed system. An in-game group finder with the ability to screen for both first-time runs and experienced players would make raiding so much more accessible, as you would finally be able to find and filter for the type of players you want to raid with in-game, rather than hopping into a half-baked matchmaker like Guided Games, or having to go to an external LFG site. And finally, to incentivize getting new people into raids, I would implement additional rewards for experienced players that are willing to take new players with them into raids. Bungie is already on a good path with this, as they added an awesome emblem that you can earn for taking 10 people through Vault of Glass for the first time. I would take this a step further and add a unique emblem for each raid for Sherpaing 10 people or more. And why stop there? I think it would be appropriate to grant 20 Spoils of Conquest to all experienced players in a raid party when completing a full raid with one or more first-timers. Basically, you'd get one additional raid drop for doing a service to the community. Considering how loot-crazed most Destiny veterans are, I think you'd see a lot more experienced players willing to accept new raiders into their fire teams. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as once you experience raiding in Destiny, you typically become a hopeless addict that's as hooked on Destiny as the rest of us. This just seems like an easy win to me. And with all these foundational improvements to raiding, let's turn our attention to how raids can be amped up to become the definitive endgame experience for PvE. Now that we've improved raids on a foundational level, let's talk about how we can amp up raids to become the Pinnacle PvE experience. Destiny 2 has been lacking long-term difficulty options for raids, with the last hard mode version of a raid coming with the prestige raid layers in the game's first year. Last Wish launched with just a singular difficulty for the raid, and all raids since have followed this trend. Thankfully, a master difficulty is coming soon for Vault of Glass, and hopefully a master version will eventually come for all raids if Master VOG is well received. I want to discuss what Master Raids in Destiny 2 should look like, both from a difficulty standpoint as well as a loot standpoint. Let's talk about the difficulty side first. Master Mode Raids should be the definitive raiding experience for hardcore players, and should serve as the ultimate PvE challenge. In Master Mode, raids should have an elemental singe that changes each week, a Master Contest modifier, placing you at 20 power below each encounter of the raid, which matches the current Day 1 raid contest modifier, a single gear check type of champion, meaning Overload, Barrier, or Unstoppable champions, and in Vault of Glass specifically, that would be Overload champions, and finally, a single mechanics-based champion type. Back in April, I made a video discussing champions, and how new champion types could evolve to exist alongside our current crop of Overload, Barrier, and Unstoppable champions. Our current champions fulfill Bungie's goal of shaking up the meta and aspirational activities season over season, and like it or hate it, it beats the alternative of sunsetting your gear. However, forcing you to change your weapons arbitrarily isn't enough to make endgame content more interesting or difficult. It just makes it different. I propose that Master Raids also include a new mechanics-based champion champion be added into the combat mix. The 3 new champion types I designed in my previous video were Succubus, Armored, and Oracle champions. Succubus champions, upon detecting a player, would begin a ritual that would start draining the non-super ability energy from all guardians in the instance, and would require players to burst them with damage to stun them and end the ritual. Armored champions would be shielded from all damage until their weak spots are all destroyed, and they would serve as commander-style enemies, granting a 20% damage buff to all nearby enemies while their shields are up. Oracle champions would spawn darkness-themed oracles and spread them throughout the area that they inhabit, and if all the oracles aren't destroyed in a timely fashion, one player in the instance would be instantly killed by a debuff called Mark of Darkness. The point of these new champion types is that Bungie needs to embrace PvE combatants that are terrifying not just because they're at a higher power level than you or because you need a specific type of weapon to stun them, but instead because they have unique mechanics that facilitates teamwork to take them down. Mechanics-based champions are probably too strong to implement into other parts of the game, but in high-end raids, I think they would fit perfectly and really amp up the combat. The combination of being 20 power below all enemies in the encounter, an elemental singe to spice up certain enemies' attacks, gear check champions requiring you to change up weapons every season, and then mechanics-based champions that effectively add another mechanic to deal with in an encounter that already has its own unique mechanics would really make Master Raids difficult and worthy of the name. And besides, who wouldn't want to see armored wyverns in Master VOG? Sorry, not sure what came over me there. Anyways, let's move on and discuss the loot side of Master Raids. For Master Raids, on your first clear per character per week, you should receive either an adept weapon or a high stat, spiky distribution armor piece, as well as 5 Spoils of Conquest for each of the main encounters. Additionally, on your first final boss clear per character per week, you should receive an Ascendant Shard. Furthermore, if your first clear of a raid in a given week is on Master Mode, you should receive the once per week drops for both normal and Master modes during your raid. This loot structure was in place all throughout Destiny 1, and also for Prestige Leviathan in Destiny 2's first year, so I see no reason to not utilize a previously great system. Finally, if you complete the entire raid, sorry, checkpoint farmers, then the final boss would grant you 1 stack of a buff called Chosen by Darkness. This would allow the player to acquire 1 adept weapon or high stat spiky distribution armor piece from the final chest vendor. This buff would be lost upon leaving the activity, so the player would have to choose a piece of adept loot then and there. The system would work like this to prevent players from having to keep track of yet another currency, and also so players can't hoard Chosen by Darkness buffs and quickly obtain all new adept weapons in future raids and dungeons. For all subsequent Master Raid runs of the week on a character, you would continue to earn 5 spoils per encounter and 1 stack of the Chosen by Darkness buff for completing the entire raid, letting players earn 1 Pinnacle weapon and 1 adept weapon of their choosing for each full Master Raid clear. With these difficulty and loot features for Master Raids, I think that hardcore players would finally have the repeatable, challenging raid experience that they've always wanted in Destiny. Now, let's turn our eyes to spicing up raids on a week-to-week basis. Now that we've improved the loot structure, accessibility, and difficulty options for raids, let's discuss how we can make raids as a whole more interesting week over week. The good news is that Bungie is already a step ahead of us on this front. We know for a fact that a weekly featured raid is eventually coming to the game due to an accidentally leaked patch note at the start of Season of the Chosen. Look at how successful and popular weekly featured raids were during the last 6 months of Destiny 1, during its Age of Triumph swan song. There are a number of easy additions that could be made to raids to make them more exciting each and every week. The first thing I would do with a weekly featured raid is simply make the featured raid the one that grants Pinnacle power level rewards that week. While I personally love Vault of Glass, it'd be a great and simple way to make the power leveling process feel less stale each week, as one of the primary in-game activities would be changing. Another benefit of this change is that it would get more people doing all the raids, not just the most current one. This is especially impactful when RNGesus is being an asshole and makes you take 67 attempts to get Eyes of Tomorrow, in which it can be difficult to get people that already have a raid's exotic to keep chugging with you to get it yourself. The second thing I would do with a weekly featured raid would be the addition of an exotic catalyst that can drop from the final boss. In Last Wish, I would add the 1000 Voices catalyst as a drop from Riven, with the catalyst granting increased ammo reserves and a plus 20 to reload speed to cement its status as a boss-slaying weapon, with more total damage output and a faster reload. In Garden of Salvation, I would add the Divinity catalyst as a drop from the Sanctified Mind, with the catalyst granting a perk called Devotion, which would make the exotic trait Penance proc faster, effectively letting the weapon do more damage when sustaining fire for long periods of time. In Deepstone Crypt, I would add the Eyes of Tomorrow catalyst as a drop from Taniks, with the catalyst granting the perk Reconstructing Ordnance, where defeating 4 or more enemies would auto-reload the weapon from reserves. This may sound broken on paper, but Bungie has clearly defined Eyes of Tomorrow as an ad-clearing rocket launcher with pitiful boss damage, so might as well give it a catalyst that makes it really, really good at that niche. And finally, I would add the Lament catalyst as a drop from Atheon, with the catalyst granting the perk Banshee's Rest, which would allow sword energy to recharge while the sword is stowed. This would essentially be auto-loading holster, but for a sword, and would allow you to use the Lament for a burst of damage with Banshee's Wail, then put it away for a time to use another weapon, and then when you pull it back out, it has max sword energy and is ready to use with Banshee's Wail immediately. And yes, I know that the Lament isn't tied to Vault of Glass as that raid's featured exotic, but Vex Mythoclast already has a catalyst that you can earn from doing a prolonged Oracle puzzle in normal mode VOG. In the lore, Lament was created for Banshee to destroy legions of Vex, so I think that there's enough of a connection between the Lament and the Vex to justify placing the Lament catalyst as a reward from Atheon. These catalysts would have a chance to drop on all weekly featured raid completions, unlike the current drop structure for raid exotics like Vex Mythoclast, which is only 3 chances per week. The drop rate for the catalyst would be increased for higher tier difficulty raid completions, meaning you'd have the lowest chance to receive a catalyst in normal mode raids, and then a higher chance in master raids, giving yet another incentive to run raids at the master level. The third thing I would do with a weekly featured raid is to allow that raid's featured exotic weapon to be a guaranteed drop from a flawless raid. This way, if you're a skilled player that wants to bypass the RNG of a raid exotic, you'd be able to do so. However, you'd only be able to knock out one a week, so it would still take you almost a month to get every active raid exotic. And yes, this would leave Garden of Salvation in an odd spot since its exotic, Divinity, is awarded from a quest and not as a random drop at the end of the raid. Perhaps a unique exotic ghost shell could be granted instead, or maybe a shader. I'm sure Bungie could come up with something desirable. The fourth thing I would add with a weekly featured raid is to grant 1 additional Ascendant Shard per character that completes the entire featured raid, no matter the difficulty level. So if you're a more casual player that just wants to run the raid on normal mode with your buddies, this would be another way to earn Ascendant Shards each week. And finally, the last thing I would add with a weekly featured raid is a Grand Master raid difficulty level. This GM raid difficulty would peg the player at 30 power below, introduce another gear check champion type, like barrier champions for Vault of Glass, include even more champions overall, and would feature the Extinguish modifier, where if your entire fire team dies, you're sent back to orbit and your checkpoint is wiped away, making you start anew from the beginning. If you have the balls to attempt a GM raid, you would earn 2 adept drops per encounter and 2 ascendant shards from the final boss in a given week. And if your first raid completion of the week is on GM difficulty, you'll reap the rewards of all the different difficulties at once, meaning you'd get a Pinnacle drop, 2 enhancement prisms, and 3 adept drops per encounter. Loot would be absolutely raining. However, you'd be doing the most difficult PvE content the game has to offer. So honestly, why not? In addition to the weekly loot drops, you'd receive 10 Spoils of Conquest and 2 stacks of the Chosen by Darkness buff for full GM raid completions for every single run on a character. Again, if you're crazy enough to want to farm GM raids, power to you. As one final incentive for running GM raids, I would make that raid's exotic catalyst become a guaranteed drop from the final boss in a full raid completion. If you're good enough to complete a GM raid, you deserve the catalyst as a testament to your skill. And just like that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this latest installment and how we can continue to evolve Destiny 2. Raids have been my favorite part of Destiny ever since I experienced the magic that was OG Vault of Glass back in the fall of 2014. Before Destiny launched, I hadn't gamed in years, and I almost didn't stick around with this franchise. But my god, Vault of Glass was one of the greatest gaming experiences I've ever had, and I've been hooked on Destiny ever since. Before we go, you may be wondering, Kujay, why didn't you bring up the potential of 8 to 12 man raids? Well, an innovation like that will likely require Bungie to wait until they cut support to last-gen consoles. And with the global computer chip shortage and most people still unable to get their hands on a next-gen console, it's unlikely that any game developer will be cutting ties to last-gen consoles anytime soon. So for now, I think that perfecting the 6-man raid experience is the way to go. With all that said, that'll be it from me this week. As always, if you want to support this channel, make sure to leave a comment down below, drop a like, and hit that sub button. Have an awesome week, guys, and I hope to catch you all in the next one. This has been your host, Kujay. Cheers.